Recent data shows an increased presence of Chinese research vessels in the Pacific. Taipei-based geospatial intelligence company IndoPacific released a video showing increased Chinese vessels in those waters this year.
Taiwan has concluded its biggest annual military exercise, Hangguang, as it continues to strengthen its defenses amid growing pressure from China.
If war breaks out around Taiwan, the Philippines would not need to fire a single missile at a commercial ship to create a shockwave across the global economy. It would not need to blockade the South China Sea, control the world's shipping lanes, or possess the world's largest navy.
LA Navy 536, this Philippine Navy government vessel FFG-7. We are conducting lawful routine maritime patrol within Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. Stay clear from our passage in accordance with the collisions regulations. Over.
The reason is much simpler. Look at the map. The Philippines sits between the South China Sea and the Pacific, directly beside the Luzon Strait, close to Taiwan, and near another important gateway through the Balabac Strait. Around these waters move enormous volumes of energy, manufactured goods, machinery, and other products that connect China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia, and economies much farther away. A new 2026 CSIS analysis estimates that roughly $6.4 trillion worth of goods passed through 8 major straits serving the South China Sea in 2024. Although that figure includes some goods counted more than once when shipments cross multiple straits. So this video is not asking whether the Philippine Navy could defeat China or whether Manila could somehow close the South China Sea. It cannot. The real question is much more interesting. What happens to global commerce when a country positioned beside critical maritime gateways becomes part of a major Indo-Pacific war? Because the Philippines does not control global trade. It sits beside several of the routes that sustain it. And if those waters become dangerous enough for shipping companies to avoid them, the consequences do not stop at Philippine shores. They can appear in insurance premiums, fuel bills, delivery schedules, factory inventories, and eventually the price of products thousands of kilometers away. That is the strategic story behind the map. And in 2026, it is becoming even harder to separate the Philippines' security from the wider economic geography of the Indo-Pacific. China is expanding infrastructure across contested parts of the South China Sea, including new construction reported this week near Antelope Reef in the Paracels, while Manila is strengthening its security relationships with Washington and Tokyo and simultaneously insisting that it does not want to become a party to a Taiwan war. The contradiction is obvious. The Philippines wants to stay out of a major war, but its geography may make it impossible to stay unaffected by one. China is to the northwest. Taiwan is just north of the Philippines. The South China Sea stretches to the west. The Philippine Sea opens toward the Pacific. And between these enormous maritime spaces are a series of narrow passages through which ships move between different parts of the global economy. This is why describing the South China Sea simply as a large body of water misses the real story. It is better understood as a network of maritime gateways. CSIS July 2026 analysis identifies 8 major straits serving the South China Sea: Balabac, Makassar, Malacca, Mindoro, Lombok, Luzon, Sunda, and Taiwan, with the important qualification that the same shipment can be counted more than once if it passes through several of these straits. That caveat actually makes the statistic more useful, not less. We are not saying that the Philippines can somehow switch off $6.4 trillion of unique global trade. That would be misleading. What the number shows is the scale of commerce moving through the maritime network surrounding the South China Sea. And that network is connected to economies representing extraordinary economic weight. CSIS estimates that the economies in and around the South China Sea accounted for approximately $24 trillion of GDP in 2024, around 22% of the global total. So when we talk about a conflict around the Philippines, we are not talking about an isolated regional shipping problem. We are talking about a potential disruption inside one of the world's most important commercial systems. That is the first major shift in how this story should be understood. The Philippines' importance is not determined by how much cargo enters Manila. It is determined by how many important routes pass around Philippine geography. Think of the system as a series of connected gates. From the Indian Ocean, ships can move towards Southeast Asia through passages such as Malacca, Sunda, and Lombok. From there, traffic reaches the South China Sea. Farther north, routes lead toward the Taiwan Strait and Luzon Strait, connecting the South China Sea with the Philippine Sea and the wider Pacific. That means a disruption in one location can change traffic patterns somewhere else. A ship does not need to stop existing because a route becomes dangerous. It can change direction. A shipping company can tell the captain to avoid an area. An insurer can increase the premium for entering a particular zone. A port can prepare for delayed arrivals. A manufacturer can order additional inventory because it is no longer certain that components will arrive on schedule. This is how maritime disruption actually works. And there is another number that makes the scale of the problem clearer. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that around 28 million barrels per day of petroleum and petroleum products traversed the South China Sea in 2023, representing approximately 37% of global maritime petroleum shipments. So this is not only about containers carrying smartphones, machinery, or consumer products. It is also about the energy that keeps factories, transport systems, and entire economies operating. Oil moves through these waters. LNG moves through these waters. Raw materials move through these waters. Industrial components move through these waters. And increasingly, sophisticated technology and machinery move through the same maritime system. CSIS estimates that around $986 billion in electrical and machinery goods passed through the Taiwan Strait alone in 2024. That is why a war around Taiwan could become much more than a military crisis. It could become a maritime supply chain crisis. And the Philippines would be sitting right beside one of the key routes through which that crisis could spread.
Taiwan's defense ministry is reporting a spike in Chinese military activity around the country.
Now move the camera north. Taiwan is here. Northern Luzon is here. And between them is the Luzon Strait. Everyone has heard of the Taiwan Strait. Everyone has heard of the Malacca Strait. But the Luzon Strait deserves much more attention because it connects the South China Sea with the Philippine Sea and sits directly between Taiwan and the northern Philippines. That makes it strategically important in both peace and war. In peacetime, commercial vessels use the surrounding maritime network to move goods between Asian economies and the wider Pacific. In a Taiwan crisis, the calculation changes. If shipping companies decide that waters around Taiwan are too dangerous, some traffic could look for alternatives. But alternatives are not free. They can require longer journeys, more fuel, higher insurance costs, and additional pressure on ports and shipping fleets. And the Luzon Strait itself is already tied to economies far beyond the immediate region. According to the 2026 CSIS analysis, approximately 16% of New Zealand's total trade passed through the Luzon Strait in 2024, while the figure for the Solomon Islands was about 41%. Think about what that means. The Luzon Strait is not simply a Philippine issue. It is not even simply a Taiwan issue. Countries thousands of kilometers away can depend on the maritime connectivity that passes through this gateway. So if a Taiwan conflict makes the Luzon Strait risky, the consequences can travel far beyond Taiwan and the Philippines. And this is where the central mystery becomes much clearer. What happens when an alternative shipping route becomes part of the battlefield itself? From Luzon, travel down toward Palawan and the Balabac Strait. This is another important part of the story because it shows that the Philippines' strategic position is not based entirely on its proximity to Taiwan. The Balabac Strait is one of the 8 major South China Sea choke points identified by CSIS. It sits between Palawan and Borneo and connects the South China Sea with the Sulu Sea and the maritime environment around Southeast Asia. On the map, this creates a remarkable picture. There is a northern gateway through the Luzon Strait, connecting Taiwan and the South China Sea to the Philippine Sea. There is a southern gateway through Balabac, connecting the South China Sea toward the Sulu Sea and Borneo. And between these strategic spaces is the Philippine archipelago. That does not mean Manila owns these international shipping routes. It does not. But it means Philippine geography sits beside several of the routes that other countries depend upon. This is the distinction that needs to remain clear throughout the entire story. Geography creates strategic importance without creating ownership. And that is why the Philippines can matter enormously to global trade without being able to control global trade.
China has launched 2 days of military exercises in the Taiwan Strait. The move comes less than a day after the country's foreign minister met with the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
Now imagine a conflict, not necessarily an invasion of the Philippines, not necessarily a decision by Manila to blockade anything. Imagine instead a major war involving China, Taiwan, and the United States in which the waters around Taiwan become dangerous for commercial shipping. The first stage would probably be uncertainty. Military exercises become larger. Airspace restrictions appear. Maritime warnings increase. Coast Guard and naval vessels become more active. Missile tests or military deployments make insurers and shipping companies reassess the risks. Commercial operators start asking a simple question. Is it worth sending a ship through this area right now? Then the situation becomes more serious. Naval forces deploy. Exclusion or danger zones appear. Commercial vessels begin avoiding certain waters. Insurance premiums rise. And shipping companies start looking for alternative routes. The ships do not disappear. They reroute. And this is where the economic consequences begin. A longer route means more fuel. More fuel means higher operating costs. Longer voyages mean fewer trips per ship. Fewer trips mean pressure on shipping capacity. Higher risk means higher insurance. And delays mean factories can wait longer for components. We have already seen a version of this mechanism elsewhere. When attacks in the Red Sea forced ships to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, CSIS noted that a Europe-Arabian Sea voyage could increase from roughly 19 days to 34 days. That meant more fuel consumption, greater pressure on the shipping fleet, and higher insurance costs. The lesson is important. Global trade does not have to stop to be disrupted. It only has to become slower, more expensive, and less predictable. This is where the title needs to be understood correctly. Can the Philippines itself close the South China Sea? No. Can Manila independently stop trillions of dollars in global commerce? No. Could a major war involving the Philippines disrupt a maritime network carrying trillions of dollars in goods? Absolutely. And the mechanism is not mysterious. It is geography followed by risk. Geography puts the Philippines beside important routes. Conflict increases risk. Risk causes shipping companies to reconsider routes. Rerouting increases distance. Greater distance increases fuel consumption and voyage time. Higher risk increases insurance. Longer and more expensive shipping affects supply chains. And supply chain disruption eventually reaches consumers and businesses far from the battlefield. That is the chain. Philippine geography, maritime choke points, conflict, risk, rerouting, higher costs, supply chain disruption. This is the real economic power of the map. The Philippines does not have to control the ocean. It only has to be located beside the ocean that other countries cannot easily avoid. Now the story shifts from trade geography to military geography. Washington sees the Philippines as strategically important, partly because of where it sits. The country is close to Taiwan. It faces the South China Sea. It sits along the first island chain. And its territory provides access and logistics options for the US-Philippine alliance. The United States and Philippines currently have 9 EDCA sites, following the addition of 4 new locations announced in 2023. Those included locations in Cagayan and Balabac Island in Palawan. The significance of those sites is not simply the facilities themselves, it is their geography. Cagayan points toward the northern Philippines and Taiwan. Balabac points toward the southern maritime environment. Together, they reinforce the importance of the Philippines as a country positioned between several major strategic spaces. Beijing looks at the same map and sees something very different. From China's perspective, the Philippines sits close to Taiwan, the South China Sea, and the routes leading into the Western Pacific, while its alliance with Washington creates the possibility that Philippine territory could become important during a US-China confrontation. That concern becomes more relevant as China's own South China Sea infrastructure continues to expand. Just this week, Reuters reported new construction on Yagong Island near Antelope Reef in the Paracels based on satellite imagery from August 17. The installation's exact function has not been confirmed, but analysts suggested they could potentially support early warning or surveillance functions. Beijing says development around Antelope Reef serves civilian purposes such as weather monitoring and scientific research. Earlier in August, Reuters reported that China had completed a first stage of work at Antelope Reef, creating an artificial island around 6 kilometers long with a harbor, wharf, and a potential runway more than 3 kilometers long. Analysts said the location could strengthen China's military position in the South China Sea, although the exact future role of the facilities remains uncertain. That is the wider 2026 picture. The competition is not standing still. China is strengthening its position. The United States is strengthening its alliance network. Japan is becoming more closely connected to Philippine security. And the Philippines is sitting in the middle of that geography. There is an unusually direct way to understand Manila's own calculation, because President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has essentially explained it himself. In May 2026, Marcos reaffirmed that the Philippines follows the One China policy and said Manila does not want to interfere in Taiwan's internal affairs.
We do not really enter into other kind of arrangements with Taiwan, again, because we hew close and continue to engage China within the context of our One China policy.
But he also acknowledged that a conflict around Taiwan would affect the Philippines because of geography and the presence of Filipinos living there. He warned that northern Luzon, and potentially the rest of Luzon, could feel the effects of an actual conflict. That distinction matters. Marcos is not saying the Philippines will fight for Taiwan. He is saying something much more practical. Look at the map. And the map tells Manila something uncomfortable. Northern Philippine territory is extremely close to Taiwan. The Luzon Strait sits between them. U.S. forces have access to Philippine facilities. Commercial shipping depends on the surrounding maritime network. And a conflict involving Taiwan could affect airspace, shipping, energy routes, military movements, and civilian evacuation, even if Manila itself does not want to become a combatant. This is why the Philippines' strategic importance is not primarily about its military strength. It is about its position.
此刻我在飞弹快艇64艇驾驶台。
Now bring all the pieces together. Imagine a Taiwan conflict beginning in the north. The Taiwan Strait becomes dangerous. Commercial shipping begins reassessing the area. Some vessels look for alternative routes. The Luzon Strait becomes more important. But if the wider Philippine Sea also becomes militarized, those alternative routes become harder to use. At the same time, the South China Sea becomes more dangerous because Chinese, Philippine, and potentially US forces are operating in a much more tense environment. And suddenly, the conflict is no longer confined to one narrow strait. It becomes a maritime network crisis. That is the key insight. A war over Taiwan does not necessarily remain a war around Taiwan. It can affect the routes connecting Taiwan to Southeast Asia to the Pacific, and the Pacific to the Indian Ocean. And that is where the Philippines becomes central. But again, there is an important reality check. A Taiwan war would not automatically mean the Philippines enters combat. Manila has repeatedly said it wants to avoid conflict and maintains its One China policy. Marcos has emphasized peaceful resolution while acknowledging that the Philippines would feel the effects because of its geographic position. That nuance actually makes the analysis stronger. Because the economic consequences do not require Philippine leaders to choose war. Geography can create consequences before political leaders make that choice. China itself is deeply exposed to the maritime network around Taiwan. CSIS estimates that in 2024, approximately 33% of China's imports and 16% of its exports pass through the Taiwan Strait. That means the same maritime geography that gives China strategic opportunities also creates economic vulnerabilities. Japan and South Korea are similarly dependent on the broader maritime system connecting East Asia to energy and raw materials. CSIS estimates that Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines collectively moved roughly $755 billion in trade through the Taiwan Strait and about $474 billion through the Malacca Strait in 2024. Taiwan itself faces an even more fundamental problem. Its economy depends on energy imports, maritime access, manufacturing and global technology supply chains. And Taiwan's semiconductor industry is deeply connected to the rest of the world. Then there is Southeast Asia. Factories across the region depend on components, machinery, energy, and raw materials moving through the same maritime network. And then there is Europe and the United States. They do not necessarily depend directly on the Luzon Strait for every shipment, but they are exposed through the global supply chains that connect Asian manufacturing to markets around the world. So the chain reaction could look like this. A conflict raises maritime risk. Shipping companies reroute. Voyages become longer. Insurance becomes more expensive. Fuel consumption rises. Delivery schedules become less reliable. Factories hold more inventory. Production costs increase. And eventually, consumers and businesses far from the battlefield begin paying the price. The Philippines does not have to export trillions of dollars for a war around the Philippines to affect trillions of dollars of commerce. Now for the part that prevents this analysis from becoming exaggerated. It would be wrong to say that if the Philippines becomes involved in a war, global trade simply collapses. It probably would not. Ships can reroute, suppliers can adapt, ports can adjust, companies can build larger inventories, governments can create emergency supply arrangements, and shipping networks are remarkably flexible when enough money is available. The Red Sea experience showed this clearly. Ships did not stop moving between Europe and Asia when the Red Sea became dangerous. They took longer routes around Africa, but the cost was significant. That is the point. The question is not simply, can global trade continue? It probably can. The real questions are, how much longer will it take? How much more will it cost? Which countries can absorb the additional expense? Which industries cannot? How long can alternative routes handle the extra demand? And perhaps most importantly, what happens if several maritime crises occur at the same time? That is where the Indo-Pacific becomes particularly vulnerable, because the region does not depend on one route. It depends on a network of routes. And if several important gateways become risky simultaneously, the alternatives become much less useful. The first scenario is the least disruptive, a Taiwan crisis without a major war. Military pressure increases, shipping companies become more cautious, and insurance costs rise, but commercial traffic continues. The Philippines strengthens surveillance and defense while trying to avoid becoming directly involved. In this scenario, the economic effect would be serious but manageable. The second scenario is a limited conflict around Taiwan that creates major shipping disruption. The Taiwan Strait becomes too risky for normal commercial traffic. Some ships reroute south and east. The Luzon Strait becomes more important, but military activity around the Philippines makes some routes more difficult as well. This is where the Philippines' geography becomes economically important. The country does not need to fire on commercial vessels. It simply needs to become part of the conflict environment. Insurance companies react, shipping companies react, ports react, markets react, and the costs spread outward. The third scenario is the most dangerous. A wider regional war involving China, Taiwan, the United States, and the Philippines. At that point, the issue is no longer one shipping choke point. The entire maritime network becomes a security problem. The Taiwan Strait is dangerous. The South China Sea is dangerous. The Luzon Strait becomes strategically contested. The Philippine Sea becomes militarized. And alternative routes begin carrying the burden of traffic that can no longer safely use the traditional paths. That would be the scenario in which the economic consequences could become truly global. But again, this is a scenario, not a prediction. The purpose of the analysis is to understand the mechanism before it happens. Now we can finally answer the title. Can the Philippines itself shut down trillions of dollars in global trade? No, that is not the right way to understand Philippine strategic power. The Philippines does not control the South China Sea. It does not control the Luzon Strait. It does not control the Balabac Strait. And it certainly does not control the world's shipping system. But can a major war involving the Philippines disrupt a maritime network carrying trillions of dollars of commerce? Yes, and the reason is geography. The Philippines sits beside important maritime gateways. Northern Philippine territory sits close to Taiwan. Its surrounding waters connect the South China Sea with the Philippine Sea and Sulu Sea. And its alliance with the United States makes its geography strategically important in any potential US-China confrontation. That produces the real thesis of this entire story. The Philippines' leverage does not come from controlling the sea. It comes from being located beside the routes that others cannot easily ignore. That is why Washington cares about Philippine geography. That is why Beijing watches Philippine military cooperation. That is why Taiwan matters to Manila, even though the Philippines maintains its one China policy. And that is why commercial shipping companies would be watching the same map if a major war ever began.